3 hours before my family found out who really owned the $6.8 million mansion they couldn't stop talking about. My brother was sitting at our parents' dinner table, calling my company a cute little hobby. He had no idea the house he desperately wanted already belonged to me. He had no idea the business he spent years mocking was worth more than anything he had ever built. And he definitely had no idea that before the night was over, the same family who spent decades treating me like the invisible child would sit in complete silence, while the truth destroyed everything they thought they knew about me. My name is Vivian Hawthorne, and this is the story of the night my family finally saw me. Chapter. One daughter thy stopped. Sini hadn't been back to my parents' house in almost 4 months, and the moment I turned onto their street in Buckhead, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. Some places never change. The Hawthorne house sat exactly where it always had, tucked behind old oak trees and manicured hedges, looking more like a country club than a family home. The stone exterior glowed in the late afternoon sun. The fountain in the circular driveway was still running. The landscaping was still perfect. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it always felt like judgment. I parked my Range Rover at the edge of the driveway and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. At 38 years old, I owned a company with more than 100 employees. I negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars without blinking. I spoke at conferences, met with investors, and made decisions that affected entire teams. And yet every time I came here, I felt 17 again, invisible. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. The smell of Margaret's roast chicken hit me before I even stepped inside. The hallway looked exactly as I remembered, and so did the walls. Pictures of Grant everywhere, Grant shaking hands with politicians, Grant graduating from business school, Grant receiving an award, Grant at charity galas, Grant standing beside luxury cars, Grant smiling next to clients, Grant. You could walk through the entire house and believe Richard and Margaret Hawthorne had only one child. I spotted exactly one photo of myself. It sat on a shelf near the staircase, partially hidden behind a framed picture of Grant at some finance conference. That felt about right. I walked into the dining room. Grant was already there. My older brother sat at the head of the table beside our father, laughing as if he owned the room. Maybe he thought he did. Richard noticed me first. Vivian? His voice was polite, not warm, just polite. I kissed Margaret on the cheek. She smiled. There was affection there. But there was also something else, pity. I had spent years learning dinner started. Within 5 minutes, the conversation became exactly what I expected. Grant this, Grant that, Grant's new fund, Grant's latest acquisition, Grant's upcoming meetings. Richard leaned forward. How is the expansion going? Very well. Grant cut into his steak. We should close another deal next quarter. Richard nodded proudly. Excellent. That's what I like to hear. Margaret smiled at him as though he had personally solved world hunger. I quietly sipped my wine. No one asked about my business. No one asked about my life. No one asked how I was doing. Again, it reminded me of another dinner. I was 18 years old. I had just won a statewide entrepreneurship competition. The ceremony had been held in downtown Atlanta. I remembered standing backstage in a blue dress, scanning the audience, looking for my father, looking for my mother, looking for anyone. They weren't there. Richard had flown to Boston that morning to attend one of Grant's academic events. He said it was important. Apparently my achievement wasn't. I accepted the award alone. I smiled for photographs alone. I celebrated alone. The memory faded as Grant's voice pulled me back into the present. I've been looking at a property in Tuxedo Park. Richard's eyes lit up. The modern one? Grant grinned. That's the one. Margaret put down her fork. The one with the glass walls? Grant nodded. The infinity pool. The skyline view, the private gym, everything. Richard laughed. That's a serious house. About 6.8 million. Grant said it casually, as if he were talking about a new watch. Margaret looked impressed. You should buy it. I'm trying. Grant leaned back. Competition is getting annoying. There are a few strong offers. You'll get it. Richard sounded completely certain. You always do. Everyone laughed. I took another sip of wine. Actually, I've been looking for a house too. The words slipped out before I could stop them. 3 faces turned toward me. Then came the laughter. Not cruel, not loud. Somehow worse. Grant smirked. Looking where? I shrugged. Still deciding. Maybe something bigger. Richard smiled the way adults smile at children who say something unrealistic. That's ambitious. I stared at him. Ambitious. I almost laughed. A flash of another memory surfaced. My 18th birthday. Grant had walked into the driveway and found a used BMW waiting for him. Richard called it an investment in his future. I opened my card later that night. Inside was a $50 bill. Margaret saw my expression. Your brother needs it more. That was what she said. Your brother needs it more. Somehow he always did. Back at the table, Grant shook his head. Well, if you ever need decorating advice for your future house, you've got plenty of experience. The table chuckled. Cute little decor company owners should stick together. I smiled politely. Inside something hardened, Richard pointed his fork toward me. Creative hobbies are fine, but reality always wins eventually. Creative hobbies. I almost heard another version of his voice. 15 years earlier, I had spent 6 months building a business plan, 6 months researching suppliers, 6 months studying the market. I printed everything and brought it to Richard's office. I still remembered how hopeful I felt. He skimmed the first few pages, then closed the folder. No serious investor would touch this. That sentence changed my life, not because he was right, because he was wrong, and I decided I would prove it. Grant continued talking. One of our biggest positions right now is Modern Hearth. That caught my attention. I kept my expression neutral. Richard nodded. The lifestyle company? Exactly, Grant smiled. They're going to dominate the market, my market. Modern Hearth was the largest competitor Hawthorne Living Collective had. Grant had no idea. To him, it was just another investment. To me, it was the company I competed against every day. Funny how the world worked. The conversation moved on. I let it. Dinner eventually ended. Grant stayed behind talking with Richard. Margaret packed leftovers into a container. She handed it to me near the kitchen island. I know things can be difficult when you're running a small business. You should take this. For a second, I simply stared at her. Not because I was angry, because I genuinely couldn't understand how little she knew about me. She thought she was helping. She thought I needed help. I accepted the container. Thanks, Mom. Drive safely. I nodded. Then I walked out. The evening air felt cool against my skin. I crossed the driveway and climbed into my car. For several minutes I just sat there. The house glowed behind me. My childhood home. The place where I spent decades trying to earn approval, trying to earn attention, trying to earn love. The strange thing was that I finally understood something. I didn't want their approval anymore. Not really. I didn't need them to tell me I mattered. I didn't need them to be proud of me. What I wanted was simpler than that. I wanted them to see the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. I started the engine, then I picked up my phone. Julian Mercer answered on the second ring. Everything okay? I looked back at the house one last time. Grant wants the house in Tuxedo Park. There was a brief pause, then Julian laughed softly. And? I smiled. For the first time all evening, so do I. The line went quiet, and I already knew exactly what came next. Chapter 2, What They Never Knew. I built. The next morning, I walked into the headquarters of Hawthorne Living Collective just before 8. The building sat in Midtown Atlanta, surrounded by glass towers and busy streets, but every time I stepped through those doors, it felt different from anywhere else in my life. This place had never made me feel invisible. The lobby buzzed with energy. Design teams were already reviewing samples. Marketing managers were moving between meetings. Large digital screens displayed product launches, sales reports, and upcoming campaigns. People smiled when they saw me, not because of my last name, because they knew me, because I had built this place with them. Good morning. Vivian morning, Vivian morning. The greetings followed me toward the elevator. I smiled back at every one of them. 20 years earlier, I would have traded anything to hear my family speak to me with half that respect. Now it came from people who weren't related to me at all. The elevator opened on the executive floor. Emma Brooks was already waiting outside my office. She held a coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. You're late. I checked my watch, by 43 seconds. She nodded, unacceptable. I laughed. Emma had been with me longer than almost anyone. Long enough to get away with comments like that. She followed me into my office. The wall of windows overlooked the Atlanta skyline. For a moment, I stood there looking out across the city. Years ago, I used to stare at these same buildings from my apartment and wonder if I would ever belong here. Now one of them had my company logo on top. Emma handed me the tablet. Sales numbers, quarterly projections, inventory updates, normal business. But before I looked at any of it, my eyes landed on a photograph sitting beside my desk. A faded picture of 2 women standing inside a garage. One was me, the other was Emma. She followed my gaze. Hard to believe that was 12 years ago. I smiled. 12 years and several nervous breakdowns ago. She laughed. That garage barely had air conditioning. The memory pulled me backward. Back to 2013. Back to the year I almost lost everything. I had been 31. The company was finally gaining traction. Orders were growing. Customers were returning. For the first time, I believed Hawthorne Living Collective might actually survive. Then a supplier disappeared. $75,000 vanished with him. In deposits. Everything. Gone. I remember sitting on the floor of that garage staring at my bank account. My hands were shaking. The company had less than a month of cash left. I could still hear Emma's voice from that night. What do we do? I didn't know. I truly didn't. During the day I took consulting contracts just to keep the lights on. At night I packed orders myself. Weekends were spent driving deliveries across Georgia. I slept 4 hours a night, sometimes less. Nobody in my family knew, nobody asked not once. The strange thing was that losing $75,000 wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing there was nobody to call, no safety net, no rescue, just me. And somehow that turned out to be enough. The memory faded as Emma dropped into a chair across from my desk. You disappeared for a second. Old memories, the expensive kind? The traumatic kind. She nodded knowingly. Those were usually the expensive ones. A knock interrupted us. Julian Mercer walked in carrying a stack of folders. Unlike Emma, Julian always looked calm. Nothing ever seemed to rattle him. Which was probably why he'd become my closest friend, and my most trusted partner. Morning, he placed the folders on my desk. I think you'll like these numbers. I opened the report. Revenue, $68 million. Debt count, 126. Showrooms across the country, new international distribution agreements. For a moment I simply stared. Not because I hadn't seen the numbers before, because I remembered where they started. A garage, a folding table, a laptop held together by hope and stubbornness. Julian leaned against the desk. The European contract should be finalized next month. Excellent. And the West Coast expansion? Ahead of schedule. Emma smiled. You know, most founders would celebrate after seeing numbers like this. I looked at them both. Most founders probably had healthier childhoods. That earned a laugh from both of them. Then Julian's expression shifted. What about the house? I leaned back. What about it? Are we doing this? I thought about Grant, about Richard, about Margaret, about that dinner. About all the years that came before it. Yes, we're doing it. By noon I was touring the property with Olivia Kent. The house sat behind private gates in Tuxedo Park. Modern architecture, flow-to-sailing glass, clean lines, natural light everywhere. The kind of place that felt expensive without trying too hard. Olivia guided me through the living room. We've had significant interest. I imagine, a few cash buyers, a few financing offers. Strong competition. I smiled. I know. She looked at me curiously. You've heard about another buyer? I had. I just didn't tell her who. The tour lasted nearly an hour. By the time we reached the terrace overlooking the city, I already knew. This wasn't just a house. It was the house, the one Grant wanted. The one he assumed would eventually belong to him. I stood at the railing and looked across Atlanta. Then I made my decision. Let's move forward. That afternoon Daniel Rhodes joined a conference call. Unlike television lawyers, Daniel wasn't dramatic. He was meticulous. Which was exactly what I wanted. The next several days became a blur. Title searches, escrow arrangements, proof of funds, contract reviews, closing documents, an LLC created specifically for the purchase. Everything clean, everything legal, everything documented, no shortcuts, no tricks, no hidden games, just business. Exactly the way I preferred it. Meanwhile, life continued, work continued, and apparently Grant continued being Grant. A few days later, Julian stepped into my office holding his phone. You're going to enjoy this. He handed it over. A social media post, Grant standing in front of a luxury restaurant with several investors. The caption talked about growth, success, momentum. I rolled my eyes. Nothing new maybe. Julian sat down. But I've been hearing some interesting things, such as a few missed targets. Some underperforming investments. Nothing confirmed, just rumors. I considered that Grant had always been excellent at appearances. The family version of success, the magazine cover version, the cocktail party version. But appearances and reality weren't always the same thing. Julian shrugged. Could be nothing, probably is. Still, the timing is interesting. Maybe. I looked back toward the city, maybe not. 3 days passed, then 4, then 5. By the end of the week, I was reviewing product samples when my phone rang. Olivia. I answered immediately. Hello. Her voice sounded cheerful. Congratulations. I sat up straighter. For a moment I didn't speak. The offer has been accepted. Silence filled the room. Emma stopped typing. Julian looked up. I slowly stood from my chair. You're sure? Completely. The sellers signed this morning. Escrow is moving forward. Everything is official. I thanked her and ended the call. Neither Emma nor Julian spoke. They simply watched me. Well? Emma finally asked. I looked at both of them, then I smiled. Not the polite smile I used for investors. Not the careful smile I used at family dinners. A real one. The house is ours. Emma jumped out of her chair. Julian laughed. For the first time all week, I allowed myself to enjoy the moment. Somewhere in Atlanta. Grant Hawthorne was probably still convinced that house belonged to him. Somewhere, he was making plans, imagining furniture, imagining parties, imagining the future. And he had absolutely no idea that future had just changed. Not because someone cheated him. Not because someone manipulated him, because someone moved faster. And for once, that someone was me. Chapter 3: House that changed everything. The closing process took less than 3 weeks. The first night I slept in the house, I barely slept at all. Not because I was uncomfortable. Because I kept waking up and realizing it was real. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Atlanta's skyline. The city lights stretched across the darkness like a sea of gold. Every room felt open, calm, intentional. For the first time in my life, I lived somewhere that felt entirely mine. No expectations, no comparisons, no Grant, just me. Over the next several weeks, the house slowly transformed. The sterile model home disappeared. In its place came warmth. Natural wood furniture from Hawthorne Living Collective, custom pieces designed by our in-house team, handcrafted ceramics from local artists. Textiles sourced from small American workshops we had partnered with for years. Every object had a story. Every corner reflected something I had built. Emma became unofficially obsessed with the project. You realize you've changed the dining room 3 times. I've changed it 4. That's worse. Julian laughed from the kitchen island. At this rate, you'll still be decorating when you're 80. I'll have excellent taste at 80. You already think you do. The 3 of us spent entire weekends working inside the house, arranging furniture, testing lighting, debating artwork, sharing takeout dinners on unpacked boxes. Somewhere along the way, I realized something. These people knew more about my life than my own family did. And unlike my family, they actually cared. One Wednesday afternoon, about 2 weeks before the housewarming party, I stopped by at my parents' house unexpectedly. Margaret had called earlier asking if I wanted coffee. The invitation surprised me enough that I accepted. When I arrived, her SUV was in the driveway. Richard's Mercedes was parked beside it. Grant's Aston Martin sat near the garage. I immediately regretted coming. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside. Voices drifted from Richard's office. The door was partially open. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Then I heard Grant's name, so I stopped walking. I still don't understand how I lost that house. Grant sounded irritated. Someone came in with an all-cash offer. Richard sighed. It happens. Not on a property like that. A few seconds passed. I should have had that house. The frustration in his voice surprised me. Grant rarely admitted disappointment. Richard leaned back in his chair. I've already spoken with a few people. About what? Finding something better. Grant laughed. There isn't anything better, then we'll find something close. The certainty in Richard's voice made me smile, even now. Even at 42 years old, my father was still trying to fix everything for him. I quietly stepped away before anyone noticed me. By the time I entered the kitchen, my expression was completely neutral. Margaret looked up from the counter. Vivian, there you are. For the next 30 minutes, we sat together drinking coffee and discussing meaningless things. Weather, traffic, local news. The entire time I kept thinking about the conversation upstairs. Grant was still angry. Good, I wanted him angry. Angry people made mistakes. A week later, the housewarming invitations went out. The guest list had taken longer than expected. Entrepreneurs, designers, investors, journalists, longtime clients, friends, and of course the Hawthorne family. The invitation itself was intentionally simple, elegant, minimal. No mention of the homeowner, no name, no explanation, just a date, a location, and an invitation. Julian reviewed the final version. You really aren't going to tell them? No, Emma grinned. This might be my favorite thing you've ever done. It's not about embarrassing them. Neither of them believed me. Honestly, neither did I. The night of the party arrived. The house looked perfect. Soft lighting illuminated the outdoor terrace. Live music drifted through the main living area. Guests filled the rooms. Servers moved quietly through the crowd. Every detail had been carefully planned. I stayed upstairs for most of the evening, not hiding, waiting. Through the railing overlooking the main floor, I watched people arrive, one by one. Then the Hawthornes walked through the front door. Richard first, Margaret beside him, Grant several steps behind. I watched their faces as they entered. Exactly as expected, impressed, curious, a little jealous. This place is unbelievable. Margaret looked around slowly. The owner must be worth a fortune. Richard nodded. The architecture alone is extraordinary. Grant stared out toward the terrace. Smart purchase. I almost laughed. For the next 20 minutes they toured the house, admiring everything, praising everything. Unknowingly praising my work. At one point Margaret stopped beside a display table. Several handcrafted ceramic pieces sat beneath a large abstract painting. She tilted her head. That looks familiar. Grant glanced over. What does? The pottery, she pointed. It looks like something from Vivian's website. Grant gave a dismissive shrug. Everything looks like something from her website. Before Margaret could respond, a woman standing nearby smiled. I actually bought those from Hawthorne Living Collective. Margaret turned. Oh. The woman continued enthusiastically. I've been collecting their pieces for years. Her husband nodded. Great company. They're everywhere now. Grant looked mildly confused. The woman kept talking. I think they're one of the most successful lifestyle brands in the country. For a second I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Then it disappeared. He still didn't understand. The timing was perfect. Julian appeared beside me. You ready? I looked down at the crowd, at my parents, at Grant, at years of assumptions, years of dismissal, years of being invisible. Yes. Julian nodded. Then he walked downstairs. A few moments later he tapped a glass. The conversation slowly faded. Guests turned toward him. Thank you all for coming tonight. The room quieted. Julian smiled. Before we continue, someone would like to say a few words. He stepped aside. Every eye in the room shifted toward the staircase. I began walking down slowly, calmly. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted them to see me, really see me. For once, by the time I reached the middle landing, the room had fallen silent. Grant stared. Margaret frowned in confusion. Richard looked completely lost. I rested one hand on the railing, then I spoke. For years, my family believed my business was a hobby. No one moved. No one spoke. I could feel hundreds of eyes fixed on me. I took a breath, then smiled. Welcome to my home. The room went silent, completely silent. A champagne glass froze halfway to someone's lips. A server stopped walking. Grant's phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor. The sound echoed through the room. Margaret's mouth slowly opened. Richard looked as if someone had physically struck him. For several seconds nobody said anything. Then reality arrived all at once. Guests began applauding. People smiled. Some laughed. Several walked toward me. Congratulations. Beautiful home. You deserve this incredible achievement. Someone mentioned an industry award. Someone else brought up a recent feature article. Another guest praised Hawthorne Living Collective's growth. The compliments blended together. But I wasn't listening. I was watching my family. Watching them realize they had spent years talking about a stranger without ever knowing she was their daughter. Eventually the crowd shifted, the noise returned. The moment passed by, or at least most of it did. A hand grabbed my arm. I turned. Grant. His expression looked nothing like confidence now. Nothing like certainty. Nothing like the man who sat at our parents' dinner table. He stared at me, then looked around the house, then back at me. For a moment it seemed like he couldn't find the words. Finally he spoke. You built all this yourself? I held his gaze and answered with a single word. Yes. The look on his face told me the real conversation had only just begun. Chapter 4: Empire Behind the Silence. For the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about that expression. Not the shock, not the embarrassment, the confusion. For the first time in his life, Grant had looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger, and in a way he was. The story moved faster than I expected after the party. 3 days later, Claire Whitmore published an article in Lifestyle Elite. The headline spread across social media before breakfast. The woman Atlanta underestimated. By noon, it was everywhere. Industry blogs, business publications, design magazines, LinkedIn and Instagram. People I hadn't spoken to in years were sending messages. Former suppliers, old classmates, past clients. Most of them said the same thing. They had no idea how large Hawthorne Living Collective had become. The funny part was that my family didn't know either. That article changed something, not for me, for them. A week after publication, I stopped by my parents' house again. Margaret answered the door. The difference was immediate. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, shoulders slightly slumped. For a moment she seemed surprised to see me, then she stepped aside. Come in. I found Richard sitting alone in the study. The article sat on his desk, folded open, marked with notes. He quickly turned it over when he saw me, as if he had been caught. That alone told me everything. The article had forced him to confront something he had avoided for years. The reality of who I was, and the reality of how wrong he had been. Meanwhile, Hawthorne Living Collective kept growing. Business didn't stop because my family finally noticed me. If anything, it accelerated. New partnerships, new licensing agreements, new acquisition opportunities. One afternoon I sat with Julian and Daniel in a conference room overlooking Midtown. A stack of reports sat between us. Daniel adjusted his glasses. We need to be very careful here. About what? The market. Julian slid several documents toward me. Modern Hearth. I looked down. The numbers weren't good, not even close. Revenue declining. Customer acquisition costs rising. Problems. Cash flow pressure. Daniel pointed at one page. They're not being attacked, they're making mistakes. That distinction mattered, a lot. I wasn't interested in destroying competitors. I wasn't interested in revenge through business. I built companies, I didn't sabotage them. Julian nodded. They expanded too aggressively, they borrowed too much. They assumed growth would continue forever. Daniel leaned back. Now the market is correcting. I looked through the reports. The truth was simple. Modern Hearth wasn't collapsing because of me. It was collapsing because it had been poorly managed. The only difference was that Hawthorne Living Collective was strong enough to take advantage of opportunities they were losing. That's how business worked. A few weeks later, another surprise arrived. Rachel Hawthorne called. My cousin rarely contacted me. We met for lunch in Alpharetta. After 20 minutes of small talk, she set down her coffee. I need to tell you something. The seriousness in her voice immediately got my attention. What is it? She hesitated, then sighed. Do you remember the retail contract you almost signed in 2016? My stomach tightened. I remembered, how could I not? That deal would have doubled my company's size overnight. Then it vanished, the night before signing. No explanation, no warning, just gone. Rachel looked uncomfortable. I know why. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. What do you mean? She looked directly at me. Grant spoke to them. I didn't say anything. For several seconds I couldn't, Rachel continued. My husband worked for one of the executives back then. He told me years ago. I stared at her. No, she nodded slowly. He told them you weren't ready. The words landed harder than I expected. He said the company was too risky. He said you couldn't handle that kind of growth. My chest tightened. For years I had wondered. For years I blamed myself. Maybe my proposal wasn't strong enough. Maybe my company wasn't ready. Maybe I wasn't ready. And all along it had been Grant. Not because he hated me. Not because he wanted to hurt me, because he genuinely believed he knew better. Because he never thought I was capable. I laughed softly. Rachel frowned. Vivian? It's funny. What is? I spent years trying to figure out what I did wrong. Rachel reached across the table. You didn't do anything wrong. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. By early summer, the pressure around Grant started becoming impossible to ignore. Financial publications began asking questions. Industry analysts raised concerns. Investors grew nervous. The confidence that once surrounded him started cracking. One evening, Julian walked into my office carrying a legal memo. You should read this. I skimmed the first page, then the second, then the third. Several investor groups were considering action against Grant's fund. Nothing official yet, but close, very close. I looked up. How bad is it? Julian didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. A few days later, the truth became even worse. Richard called unexpectedly. His voice sounded strained. Can we talk? I drove over that evening. For the first time in my life, both of my parents looked scared. Not worried. Scared. Richard sat at the dining room table. Margaret beside him. Neither touched the coffee in front of them. Finally, Richard spoke. We may have a problem. I already knew, but I let him continue. Over the next 30 minutes, pieces started falling into place. Retirement accounts, personal guarantees, loans, collateral. They had backed Grant, repeatedly for years, whenever he needed help, whenever a deal became risky, whenever an investment needed support. They were there, the retirement fund, their savings, parts of their property, everything connected to him, everything dependent on him succeeding. And now Grant wasn't succeeding. Margaret looked down at the table. We believed in him. I almost responded, so did I once. Instead, I stayed silent. The most shocking revelation came a week later. Grant requested a meeting. Just him, no parents, no lawyers, no audience. We met in a private conference room downtown. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he slid a document across the table. I looked down. A rejected acquisition proposal, 3 years old. My eyes narrowed. The target company was Hawthorne Living Collective. My company, the buyer, was an investment fund controlled by Grant. I slowly looked up. He gave a bitter laugh. I never knew it was yours. The room went quiet. I tried to buy your company. Apparently, he shook his head. The board rejected it. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then realization crossed his face, not sudden, not dramatic, slow, painful, almost human. All those years. All those business meetings. All those market reports. All those competitors he analyzed. All those opportunities he chased. And somehow he never realized he had been standing across from me the entire time. A month later, the final blow arrived. The headline appeared shortly after 7 in the morning. Modern Hearth Files for Chapter 11 Bankruptcy Protection. I stared at the screen, then closed my eyes. Across Atlanta, I knew Grant was reading the same headline. The difference was that for him, it wasn't news. It was the beginning of the end. Chapter 5, the day they finally sell me. 3 months passed before I heard Grant say my name without contempt in his voice. By then, the house in Tuxedo Park no longer felt like a symbol. It felt like home. The rooms had softened around me. The dining room table had finally been used for something other than staging photographs. The terrace had become my favorite place to drink coffee before sunrise. The living room no longer looked like a design magazine spread. Even though Claire Whitmore had tried very hard to photograph it that way. There were books on the side tables now. A cashmere throw over the sofa. Fresh flowers in a ceramic vase. Emma had chosen because she said every CEO needed at least one impractical thing in her life. Hawthorne Living Collective was growing faster than we projected. The European contract closed. The sustainable home line sold out twice. A new showroom in Los Angeles was already under construction. For once, success did not feel like armor, it felt like air. One Friday evening, Emma and Julian stayed late after a strategy meeting. We ended up eating Thai food at my kitchen island. passing cartons between us like college roommates. Emma pointed her chopsticks at Julian. You know you are physically incapable of ordering normal food. Julian glanced at his container. This is normal. That has 3 chili peppers next to it. Flavor builds character. I laughed harder than I expected to. The sound surprised me. Maybe because it was easy, maybe because nothing in that room had to be earned. Emma looked at me. What? I shook my head. Nothing. Julian studied me with that quiet way he had, then he said gently. You're allowed to be happy here, Vivian. I looked around the kitchen, at the city beyond the glass, at the people sitting beside me. Neither of them shared my blood, neither carried the Hawthorne name. But they had stood beside me in garages, boardrooms, crisis calls, and every hard season in between. For a moment I understood something so clearly it almost hurt. Family was not always the people who raised you. Sometimes family was the people who stayed. Sunday morning came gray and quiet. I was in the living room reviewing fabric samples when the security panel chimed. The front gate camera appeared on my phone. Richard, Margaret. Grant, all 3 of them stood outside my gate. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Richard looked thinner. Margaret looked pale. Grant looked like a man who had not slept in days. For once, no one looked powerful. I pressed the button, the gates opened. A minute later, they stood in my foyer, the same foyer where they had once walked in as guests, admiring everything, not knowing it belonged to me. This time they knew, and that knowledge hung between us like weather. Margaret clutched her purse with both hands. Richard avoided looking directly at me. Grant kept his eyes on the floor. I led them into the living room. No one sat until I did. That alone told me how much had changed. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Richard cleared his throat. We need your help. There it was. Not hello. Not how have you been. Not we are sorry. Just need. I folded my hands in my lap. With what? Richard swallowed. The fund is collapsing. Grant flinched at the word. Margaret's eyes filled immediately. Your brother made some mistakes. I looked at her. Some mistakes? She lowered her eyes. Richard continued. We guaranteed several positions. I already knew most of it, but hearing it from him made it colder. Retirement accounts, loans, personal guarantees, collateral, the house in Buckhead. Decades of money placed behind Grant's certainty. Behind the golden child who was never supposed to lose. Richard's voice cracked slightly. We thought we were protecting the family. I said nothing. He looked at me then, really looked, not at the version of me he had invented. Not at the daughter who needed advice. Not at the creative child with unrealistic hobbies, me. I spent my whole life betting on the wrong child. The room went still. Margaret made a small sound, like the words had physically hurt her, for almost 30 years. I had wanted something like that, a confession, an admission, proof that I had not imagined the imbalance, proof that I had not been too sensitive, too bitter, too dramatic. And yet hearing it did not feel the way I thought it would. It did not heal the old wound. It simply named it. Margaret pressed a tissue to her mouth. I spent so much time protecting Grant that I stopped seeing you. Her voice broke. I saw your success and I called it luck. I looked at her sharply. She continued crying, and now I knew more than I admitted. That hurt more than ignorance. Ignorance could be explained. This could not. You knew? She nodded. Pieces, articles, mentions. People talked. I just kept telling myself you were doing fine. Richard looked down. We both did. Later, Rachel would confirm even more. They had known Hawthorne Living Collective was larger than they pretended. They had known I was no longer struggling. But accepting that truth meant admitting they had been wrong about me. So they chose the easier story. That I was lucky. That I had help. That it was not real business. That Grant was still the one who mattered most. I looked at my parents and finally understood. The problem had never been my accomplishments. The problem had been their refusal to let those accomplishments change the story they preferred. Grant finally lifted his head. His face looked hollow. He glanced around the room, at the furniture, the art, the sunlight falling across the floor, then back at me. You bought the house. Yes. You built the company. Yes. His jaw tightened. You bought parts of Modern Hearth after the filing, through a court-approved bankruptcy sale. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Of course you did. No one moved. The silence that followed was different from the one at the party. That silence had been shock. This one was surrender. Grant looked at me for a long time. Then his shoulders dropped. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller than me. Not physically. In every way that mattered. You were better than me. Margaret closed her eyes. Richard did not speak. Grant kept going. You were always better at the one thing I kept pretending was mine. Business, vision, discipline. Patience. The truth sat in the center of the room, simple and undeniable. I thought I would feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt tired. And strangely free. Grant rubbed his hands over his face. Can you help us? There it was. The actual reason they came. I looked at my brother, then at my parents. I thought of the dinner table, the laughter, the $50 birthday envelope, the empty seat at my award ceremony. The 2016 contract he had poisoned with a sentence, the years I spent wondering why I was not enough. Then I thought of Emma and Julian eating takeout in my kitchen, of employees who trusted me, of the company I had built from nothing, of the woman I had become when no one in this room was watching. No. Margaret let out a broken breath. Richard's face tightened. Grant stared at me. I spoke calmly. I will not pay off Grant's losses, Vivian. Richard's voice sounded desperate now. I raised one hand. I didn't ruin your life. Your choices did. Grant looked away. I continued. You invested in him because you wanted him to be what you imagined. My voice stayed steady. You ignored every warning because admitting he could fail meant admitting I could succeed. No one answered, because there was nothing left to deny. I stood. The conversation was over. I walked them to the door. Margaret paused in the foyer. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to hug me. I did not step forward. She understood, maybe for the first time. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Grant was the last to leave. At the threshold, he turned back. I'm sorry. The words were quiet, late, imperfect. But real. I nodded once, then I closed the door. I stood there for a long time after they left. The house was silent. Not empty silent. There was a difference. That evening, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened a small box I had kept through every move. Inside was a photograph from my 18th birthday. I was standing beside the kitchen counter in my parents' house, holding a card with both hands, trying very hard to look grateful. I studied that girl for a long time. She looked so young, so hopeful, so hungry to be seen. I wanted to reach through the paper and tell her she would survive that house. She would build her own. She would stop begging for a seat at a table that had never been set for her. Outside, Atlanta glittered beneath the night sky. I set the photograph on the dresser. Then I walked to the window. For the first time, I did not wonder what my parents thought of me. I did not wonder whether Grant respected me. I did not wonder if being successful would finally make me worthy of love. I already was. The peace that came over me was quiet. No applause, no dramatic ending, no final victory speech, just breath, just stillness, just the knowledge that I had been seen at last. And more importantly, that I had finally seen myself. If you had been in my place, would you have helped them after everything they did? Or would you have closed the door too? Let me know what you think, and if stories about family betrayal, quiet revenge, and women finally reclaiming their powers speak to you, stay with us for the next one.